Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm a little bit dark, a little bit on an unusual background, but I'm Alex Mustard. I'm here in the Cayman Islands, and we thought because this is my day off between running two workshops, I said goodbye to the first group this morning, and the next group I do the welcome talk for this evening. And I thought that it was a good chance to jump online and talk about what I've been up to this week.
Yeah. So I know the exciting. Obviously, you've been to Cayman, roughly a million times at this point. But the exciting thing is you've mostly been shooting a new camera all week. So we're going to do a whole big, all your thoughts about that, what it's been like shooting it.
Yeah, here it is. Look, it's got the word Canon written on it, which is not a brand I shoot that much. And the other important part of this, which you'll probably all know from the video, is that this is the Canon R5 Mark II. And I think this is an incredibly important camera for Canon photographers. I mean, for me, the sort of the headline about it is, I think it's the first camera that I would say, if you're a Canon SLR shooter, this is the no-brain upgrade. Into mirrorless. This is the camera to jump for, in the same way that the Z8 was for Nikon shooters. I always felt that the Canon R5 Mark I, or it's just called the R5, had a great sensor, had great autofocus, but I don't think performed as well underwater, particularly because the EVF was really quite a disappointment. The autofocus specialities maybe didn't suit underwater photography quite as much. And I think although it was a very credible camera, it didn't quite cross the line of being a no-brain switch to mirrorless camera for a Canon SLR user. Whereas I think this camera very firmly goes over that line because the strengths are there from the R5 Mark I, and it answers, I think, some of the weaknesses of the R5 Mark I, particularly the EVF. The EVF for me is night and day compared to the R5 Mark I. It's got, if you've ever shot, one of my favorite Canon cameras is the Canon R3. It's a lovely camera. It's got beautiful EVF, very natural feeling electronic viewfinder EVF. It's got great autofocus. And I have to say that this camera really feels like an R3, but instead of being limited to 20 megapixels, it's got that full 45 megapixel sensor, which, I think that's really what a lot of underwater photographers like to shoot. It's been, since the D800 or whatever, it's the high resolution cameras that we tend to gravitate towards. And we want with that good autofocus performance. And I think the R5 really does that. So I think my headline from this is, whether you're Sony, Nikon or Canon, all three companies now have really strong mirrorless products, whether it's the Sony A7R5, the Nikon Z8, or the Canon R5 Mark II. But I would say that, lots of reviewers and lots of online articles and forums will argue about the differences between those three cameras. For me, it's actually the fact that they're all very similar to use. And the shooting experience of all three is very similar. I've shot all three here in Cayman. So I've had the opportunity to shoot these same reefs. And I would say that all three of them feel very similar. I've shot all three of them in Nauticam housings, which kind of, I guess, also makes the experience very similar. But yeah, I think that's the great news, is that now, whichever brand you've been loyal to, you've really got a proper camera to dump SLR gear for and really switch to mirrorless for.
What do you think about, so one thing you mentioned that I think is significant is a lot of the differences that people find in individual camera bodies are more significant on land than they are underwater. Because as soon as you put those cameras in a housing, especially if it's the same brand housing, they all handle and feel relatively similar. I mean, buttons and things might be in different places, maybe the housing there, but for the most part, they all are very, very similar. Like you would have to look at the name on the housing to see which camera goes in there between, Z8, R5 II, and A7 R5, other than maybe some size differences. But I think that's one thing that topside shooters will argue over a lot, is the ergonomics, which is fair, but I don't think that applies as much to underwater shooters.
Yeah, in fact, I've not shot this camera out of the housing yet, so I can't comment on the topside ergonomics. I have to say, I was very impressed by this Nauticam housing. It feels very full-featured, which is really, really nice. It's a little, it's got bigger displacement than my Sony housing. So in the water, it's definitely much more neutral feeling than my Sony housing. I think ergonomically, everything falls very nicely to position, especially if you're used to Canon shooting. Like the Nauticam Z housings, you've got separate lens releases for when you're using an RF lens and when you're using an EF lens. I've got my FCP on here because I was lent the housing and the camera by Rephoto Video and Nauticam, and they gave me they just gave me it with a WWL on the front, and I didn't really want to shoot the WWL, so I converted my FCP back to N120. I've been shooting that all week, so most of the shots that we'll show you in a minute are shot with that. I've used it on about half the dives. I was kind of switching backwards and forwards between this and my Sony during the day, and I think that's quite a nice thing to do when you're reviewing, because it keeps giving you that baseline to compare against.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I wouldn't have shot it this much if I didn't feel it was performing. So that's the bottom. That for me is the bottom line. The housing was very, very nice to use. It really feels robust, very, very nice ergonomically, and it feels like a very mature product. I mean, it's the R5 Mark 1 housings were were related to the EOS housings before them, the 5Ds and things. And it just feels like a very mature product. The only strange thing on the housing, actually, that's weird, is it's got an on-off switch on the top. And I've never felt a Nauticam switch that feels like it. I can't really show it to you very easily on the thing. It's this big round thing on the top that you turn. It works perfectly well. It's just, you get used to, the sort of switch gear that Nauticam use. And I've never seen anything like this kind of this funnel-y type on-off switch on the top, which does work very well. It just it feels like it's something new. I guess you when you shoot lots of housings, you notice what's new. I'll stick some videos over of me shooting the housing. I haven't got a lot of video, but I've got a little bit of footage of me shooting the housing over the video, so you can see it in the water.
So I guess the big question is, if somebody told you that you had to shoot the R5 Mark II as your main camera, would you be okay with that?
Yes. I would say that in comparison to the Sony cameras that I normally shoot and the Nikon Z8, I think there's areas where it's a little behind, areas where it's a little ahead. But ultimately the performance is very, very similar. It's much more similar than they are different.
Yeah.
I think that the Canon R5 Mark II has got probably the best high ISO noise performance of all of them. So if that's something important to you, you might be looking at that. I felt its dynamic range was a bit less than the others. I think it's a bit prone to blowing out the sunburst, and that can be just the difference between one dive and the next, but I kind of felt that. I've read, and I haven't tested it myself, that on electronic shutter, it loses a bit more dynamic range than when you use mechanical shutter. I don't know if that's true or not, but I used it on mechanical shutter the whole way through, just to be sure. It does have slightly better sync speed than the Nikon Z8, but less good, and the same as the A7R5 at 1/250th. I've had the Nauticam trigger on it, and I was fine with the Nauticam triggers. I never get the maximum sync speed with my retro flashes, and I don't know quite where the problem in that. If I use a different brand trigger, I'm fine. But I always seem to lose that. I'm never quite sure what's the cause of this, whether it's some setting I have to change or something somewhere. But so I get 1/200th out of it rather than 1/250th. But I think with another trigger, I'd get 1/250th, no problem. I would say that its star turn, I think it's got the best, it's got the smartest, and by smartest I mean the most intelligent autofocus system of any of those cameras that I've mentioned.
So sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but while I have the thought, because one thing we talked about in a recent episode, because I've been shooting the A9 III. The A9 III has ridiculous autofocus, but it can be complicated to set up, especially if you're shooting a lot of different things. It can be complicated to optimize the autofocus for what you're shooting. Is the Canon system simpler, or dumber is not quite the right word, but like with more, you can turn it on and go?
Yes, and I'm a big fan of often when I'm taking cameras for review, is not read every last page of a manual first of all, because I think it tells you a lot about how intuitive they are. And I think that it's one of the things I think the R5 Mark II has done over the Mark I is that the autofocus system is easier to understand. I'm not a native Canon speaker, but I found it nice and easy to use. I generally left it on continuous servo, continuous autofocus mode. I use the subject recognition a lot in macro because it's so smart. It's really, really good for macro, and I'll show you some examples when we look through some of the macro shots in a minute. And I would either use spot metering, single point, expanded single point for macro. Those first three on the menu are very good for macro. And for wide angle, I just use the whole sensor, the wide area one. And those modes work really, really well. I would sometimes have subject selection on for macro, most of the time for macro, because it's just super smart. And all of those modes very much perform like a tracking mode. They all hold on to subjects very well. I would say it's all the mirrorless cameras, the autofocus is a little bit different from SLRs, and they're all a little bit different to get used to. I'd found my first macro dive with the R5 Mark II. I was struggling to get stuff in focus. And I was just shooting macro with it yesterday, and I was there going, this is the best macro autofocus camera I've ever used. Because it just takes a little time just to get into their way of thinking. Because they're intelligent, you've kind of got to understand that intelligence a bit. So I would say that, once you've done 5 to 10 dives with it on macro, you'll really, really love that autofocus. I was shooting super macro yesterday, SMC3, super macro shooting, and it would just pick up the eye of everything. And it was just super easy. I'll show you a picture of me. I was shooting Shaun the Sheep slugs, which are notoriously a pain to focus on. Shot them on full autofocus and just let the camera pick the eyes. It's that easy. It's subjects that, are used to the old days. It was all fixed focus, loads of rocking in and out. And now it's just turn the autofocus on and hit the shutter. And I think that is what it does. It's obviously, being a mirrorless camera, very good at tracking moving fish. And I think that's another area. It's very good at tracking moving fish and picking eyes. And the animal autofocus on it, has no issue with any marine or any normal-looking marine life. It's not going to pick the eye of a tunicate, but it is going to pick the eye of things that have eyes. And so I was very impressed with that. Maybe I can pull some of those pictures up now.
Yeah. While we're doing that, does the eye autofocus act like? I guess you have that turned on all the time. When it spots an eye, it'll just lock onto it.
Yeah. The subject recognition, I keep it on I've been using the animal one. And for most of the time with macro, I have that on. And for most of the time with wide angle, I turn it off. I think particularly because I was shooting sponges and things like that. And sometimes, as is on the screen now, sponges can look a bit like faces. And I just, it's easier just to leave it off. But I generally found the autofocus very, very good. The area that it struggles with, and it's the same with all the mirrorless cameras, is that if you're in bright light and the subject is under an overhang in the dark, that's when the mirrorless cameras are unhappy. And I remember I was just shooting a very, very simple subject, which is just a Graysby grouper sitting on a sponge. And it was just in the shade of an overhang. And the camera really struggled with that. Whereas a fast-moving little fairy basslet doing this, and the camera was just tracking it like mad. And it's crazy that sometimes it can't do the easy things and it can do the difficult things. But overall, I think the autofocus is fantastic on it. I think the EVF is a massive step up. And I would say that of the Z8, the A7R5, and this, for me, in underwater shooting, it probably has the best autofocus of the three. They've all got slightly different strengths and weaknesses, and they're all very, very good. I would say that dynamic range, it's a bit behind the other two. And I'll show you some pictures to talk about that. Anyway, I put this first one in because there was actually some video footage of me actually shooting this shot. Or me starting to fiddle with my strobes to get the inward lighting set up correctly. So it's just before I took this shot, but I'll start with that one. I've been in Cayman, so we've been shooting reef wide angle a lot. So I'd show some of these brief wide-angle pictures. Generally, it does a very nice job. These are all shot with the FCP because I don't have any other lenses really for wide-angle with it. But that's a nice versatile lens to be able to shoot lots of stuff. I'm onto the third one now, and I know you can't see what I'm looking at.
How did you like the FCP performance with the R5?
The FCP is a very likable lens. You put it on and you like it. It just does everything you want it to do. I'm using it with the 24-50 with the RF lens, and that's worked really, really well with it. Occasionally, if I'm in a very dark environment, I might zoom it out too far, because obviously if you go beyond 28, you start to see the shades. But it's in normal diving, you see the shades straight away. But a couple of the shots in the caves, I zoomed it out too far, and because basically the view was very dark when I was shooting, I didn't see the shades coming in. But I feel that 24-50 works very well with the FCP. Yeah, so I'm really happy with that. This one's shot with a single strobe, just angled in, single strobe doing side lighting, but with kind of an inward lighting setup. And then here are just a couple of reef shots. You see for this type of photography, it does a very nice job. There's not much to say here. I'm rolling through. I'm trying to see what page I'm on. So I'm on page 5 now of them, so you can keep up with where I am. These are on Little Cayman. We did a nice day trip out to Little Cayman from Grand Cayman. Where the operator that I run my workshops with here, Ocean Frontiers, their boats are fast enough that we can do day trips to Little Cayman, which is quite cool when the weather allows. So these are on Little Cayman, even though I'm running a workshop on Grand Cayman.
The colors look good too.
Yeah, generally, I think the FCP, as we may have talked about before, does put a bit of a color shift on your pictures. It pushes them basically warmer, which when you shoot big animals is almost an advantage. But for close focus wide angle, I find I don't quite like the colors. And so I would say that the color performance is where it's maybe not perfect. And it's me being ultra fussy is a little bit driven from FCP. I just sometimes find it quite hard to tune the white balance with the FCP. And I generally shot all these on a fixed Kelvin white balance. But yes, because I find that gives me a better result straight out of camera. I'm now on to number 7. And this was just an example of the sync speed test. So this is just the picture on the left is at 1/250th, and you can see that shading coming in from the bottom of the frame. And then the picture on the right is at 1/200th. And so with the trigger I was using, which was just the standard Nauticam trigger, I wasn't getting the full sync speed. If I went to 250th, I'd get that darkening out at the bottom of the frame. So I just put that in to remind me to talk about that. The reefs here at the east end of Grand Cayman are full of caves and caverns, and they're a great place for testing out both dynamic range and high ISO noise. And this is just in some of those coral caverns shooting out to the blue. And I've done these shots with all the cameras, and the level of noise from this is probably shot on ISO 1000 or 1600 or something like that. The level of noise from the R5 Mark II was impressively low. Like different world to the A7 R5, and which is quite a noisy camera at higher ISO. And I also felt that the shadow detail was pretty impressive, probably not quite as good as the others. This next shot, I thought the next shot was another shot of cave. I must have not put it in. But yeah, the shadow detail was good as well. Maybe not quite as much range as the others, but very, very clean files.
How's it compare to the A1 in terms of its high ISO performance?
I would say the A1 is similar. I think that it might be slightly better, but I didn't really test it. I was just really surprised how good it was, and that suggested in my mind it's probably maybe slightly ahead of the A1. But I'd really want to do a back-to-back. I think they're comparable, but maybe the R5 in terms of noise is better. But I think what's also important at high ISO shooting is also the loss of dynamic range as you push those ISOs up.
Yeah, I
would say that maybe the A1 is maybe better in loss. It loses less dynamic range, but is maybe a little bit noisier. Right. I've now moved on to some macro shots. I'm on number 9, which is a fairy basslet. And these are a subject that if you ever photograph them in the Caribbean, they're very pretty fish. They never stop moving. They do swim reasonably repeatable patterns. And yeah, this was just an example of how the autofocus just was. I had the autofocus on spot, but actually it overrid my spot. I didn't have to move the spot, and the autofocus sensor just recognized this is an animal. I'm going to put the autofocus on the eye, and it just tracked the eye for me. And these guys go like this,
yeah,
when you're shooting them. And I've got shots where you're just running at the camera and he's still in focus.
Nice.
So yeah, I was really impressed. They were a great subject for that. Like all mirrorless cameras, it's very, very good at just grabbing a subject and allowing you just to, wait for the moment that you want to hit the shutter. In this case here, when this is number 10, when the chub's pectoral fins came forward, just gave something to the composition. And yeah, I love that fact on the mirrorless cameras that once you're locked on, you can just sit there on the EVF, wait for that prime moment to shoot.
How are you liking I assume these macro shots are with the RF100. How do you like that lens?
Yeah, it's very nice. I'm really keen to talk to you about macro lenses, but that's the subject of another episode. But yeah, it's a nice lens. It's nice and light too, which I do like. It's good for travel. It's quite a long lens, as you can see. I'm holding it up here in the corner. But yeah, I felt it perform very well. Like I said, the autofocus took a bit of getting to know, but after that, I felt it was very accurate, very sharp, very good image quality, and I like that this lens is light. It didn't absolutely blow me away, the lens. When I tried the final generation of EF 100mm, there was I think it was the Mark II 100 macro L lens. I can't remember. That lens really felt like a game changer. This just feels basically as good as all the other best macro lenses. It doesn't feel in a different league. But I put the shot that's up now, number 11, is just this was a grab shot. This little blenny popped his head out this tube and then was gone. And I just happened, the autofocus just grabbed onto it. But I think I put this one in just to talk about the bokeh. I think that the bokeh of the Reef is very pleasing and soft. And I think it's a very natural looking bokeh. And I think the bokeh is slightly better than my Sony bokeh, which I thought is nice. Switching over to super macro. This is as a mantis now, just skip the mantis. But it's, I think, an area that all the mirrorless cameras, I'm on number 13 now, it's a picture of a 3-spot damselfish guarding its eggs, which is laid on an old piece of coral. I think this is when the mirrorless cameras are very strong, in that you can set up a shot like this and it'll just track the fish. And this guy was coming and attacking me, then going back and checking his eggs, and then chasing off some other fish and coming back to his eggs, and the camera was just made a shot like this super easy. I think in the old days on SLR, I would just focus on the eggs and then try and time the shot when the fish would be in parallel with the eggs. And now I just let the camera do the hard work and follow the fish around. Into super macro now. And the first one is a spiny head blenny. And if you've ever photographed, this was actually taken yesterday, and it was quite surgy yesterday on the dive. In fact, I was the only person stupid enough to shoot macro. The guys were shooting wide angle, and a lot of them were saying it was almost too surgy to shoot wide angle on this dive because they were being moved around so much. I was shooting super macro in those same conditions, but because the camera's autofocus was so good, I couldn't really hold the camera still when I was shooting this. I was still able to just trust the autofocus. Shot with an SMC3, so high magnification shot, and if you photographed these spiny head blennies, when they yawn, they tend to yawn and then move their head like this. And I was just able to track him. And, I must have got, 20, 30 shots, mouth open, and in focus. But I think this side was on one was better. The head-on ones, I didn't get such good eye contact. So, but on this particular day. But yeah, really nice. Yeah, and in the conditions, very, it wasn't an easy one. This was taken in much calmer conditions. This is a rough head blenny, the golden form of the rough head blenny. And again, this was one where the subject that I was shooting super macro. If you've ever shot these guys, you'll realize how small they are. Everyone always thinks they're much bigger than they are.
It's like a match head.
Yeah, and the autofocus just put a square on the eye. And I was looking through the viewfinder, and there's just a big square on the eye, and I was just like, click, 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 click. Right, move on to the next subject. So I was very impressed with the autofocus in super macro. And this is one of the Shaun the Sheep shots. This was a shot, this is anyone that's been cropped, I think. This was shot as a horizontal, but I've cropped it into a vertical because they're very small. But on this case here, the autofocus, I don't know how well you can see it, but it was able to hold those eyes.
Yeah.
Which, Shaun the Sheeps are normally like a rocking in and out nightmare. And the Caribbean Shaun the Sheeps, because they've got a lot of pigment in their face, they're tough to shoot. So I was very impressed with this. I just pointed the thing at it and shot them. Right. And then just some bigger animals to finish. When I went to the Stingrays, I actually was using the Sony most of the time because I had the big dome on the Sony, and because I don't have a dome for this, I couldn't really, I just took it in for 10 minutes and just did a few shots. But this is one of the Stingrays at the sandbar, a nice just little black and white shot. You see there's plenty of adjustability in the files to really make these shots pop. And I even tried a split level with the FCP. So you can do split levels with the FCP. It's not the right tool for the job, but it does work. So this was my shot to prove you can do it. But yeah, I'd also lent my Nikon fisheye to one of the guys on the workshop because they wanted to do split levels and they didn't have the right fisheye. So so I was limited by what I could do on this morning with that lens. Right. And then I think the final one's just a couple of reef shark shots. It was a bit of a murky day when we went to try to see them. And so I did quite a lot of panning shots because they're good for hiding the muck in the water. So they're a good problem solver. So this is one just cruising over the nice Gorgonians.
So this is going to go back a ways, but I remember a long time ago, you had posted on Facebook, and then I think you and I discussed it in an episode about how you had issues with panning with some of the Sony cameras where it didn't seem like anything in the frame was sharp. Yeah. And I have encountered that same issue, especially with the A7R5. Does the Canon have those same sort of problems?
I didn't have any problems at all. I would say, though, that I have modified my technique since that problem. So the problem is that I used to do these shots with very fast whip panning, where you move the camera as fast as you possibly can, and then you create the maximum amount of blur without having to go that slow on the shutter speed. And it's that vigorous movement that we think was basically unseating the IBIS, the image stabilized sensor, and moving it out of the correct position. Therefore, the picture would drop out of focus. So the camera thought it was in focus, but you've wobbled the sensor. And by wobbling the sensor, you've knocked the picture out of focus. And that's what we think was going on. So I now do all these panning shots with just smooth movements, and I have no problem at all with any.
Oh, nice.
So I've kind of changed my technique, and I shot all of these with just smooth pans. Whereas on the SLR days, we used to do this quick flick. I now do smoother pans. So I didn't really test that, but I didn't have any problem with lack of sharpness. I can't zoom in on these in the slideshow, but hopefully you can see on the screen that they are nice and sharp. I think that's our last one. Oh no, there's just sort of fish.
Cool Masters at the bottom.
Just another little Cayman, just a little group. This was another shot where I felt that the dynamic range was maybe, they just seemed, I don't normally get them as whiting out as this when I shot them. And I don't think my lighting was poor or anything in this shot. And I wonder whether this was, maybe just that dynamic range not quite being there. I just feel that, a Nikon Z8 or maybe an A7R5 would be a bit more forgiving. But maybe it was just the fish were a bit brighter that day. They all changed color, the fish, and maybe they were just very silvery and my strobe positionings weren't quite right or something like that. I just to finish off on that. Right, I'll put us back on the screen and then we should wrap this up. But ultimately, I think I'll come back to what I said at the beginning, that I think that for me, the R5 Mark II, and I presume the R6 Mark II as well, because they're related cameras, it did exactly what I hoped Canon would do with it. This EVF is lovely. It really is nice. It's got that quality feel of the R3. The autofocus is smart. You need to understand how smart it is, I think, to get the most out of it. But the more you shoot it, you quickly adapt to it. It's a lovely big viewfinder as well. Very bright, very nice EVF. I haven't mentioned it yet, but the battery performance is also really impressive on this camera. I'm used to doing 2 dives and changing. I did 3 dives a couple of times with this, and it still had decent battery left. Most of the time, when I've done 2 dives, the battery's only gone down 1 bar out of 4 on the viewfinder. So so the battery life definitely seems a big advantage. I was using EVF almost the entire time as well, which is more power hungry than the screen. I don't use the screen on it. But yeah, really, really nice. I'd like to have tried it with a few more lenses. I'd like to have tried it with the 8-15, but I didn't have access to one. And it was fine with the FCP. It worked well. And there weren't any subjects that I felt I needed to go to the WWL for because I had an FCP. So like the sharks and the stingrays, I shot them with the FCP because it could just handle everything. I shot it with both the Retro Pro Max strobes and also the backscatter HF1s. And yeah, it performed well with both. I think both though were limited to 1/200th, and I think that was the Nauticam trigger, or me not getting some setting right. But yeah, ultimately it was a very nice camera to use. They cover up the eye detection sensor. So one of the things that's liked about this camera on land is that you can aim the autofocus by where you look in the frame.
Yeah.
But that's blocked in the housing. I don't think it works. But the autofocus always seemed to go where I wanted it anyway. So I didn't feel that was a big loss. But ultimately, I think it's an absolutely credible alternative to any of them. And I do think we're in a situation now that if you have loyalty to a brand, you don't now need to go, oh gosh, the grass is greener over there. I think the grass is very green, whether you're a Canon user, a Nikon user, or a Sony user. They're all 3 cameras at a very similar level. There are differences between them, and I think discussion reviews and forums will probably accentuate those differences, but ultimately they're far more similar than they are different, and they're all very credible cameras. And yeah, I've really enjoyed shooting it this week.
I guess that says everything we need to know, that you've enjoyed it, so that's a pretty resounding endorsement for it. And it seems like a good place to wrap up. Thank you for taking the time to do this from warm Cayman while I'm in freezing Florida. And we will see you guys soon in the next episode.